Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to Adult Formation this morning. This morning's presentation is Strangers in a Strange Land, continuing our series on pilgrimage. And I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jeff Leonard, who is professor teaching Hebrew Bible at Samford.
Off a little bit of a cough. The stakes are higher in the world of COVID. You cough twice and you get kicked off the island. It's not that. I'm not in dire straits or anything like that. But my job involves mainly talking a lot. And when I get hoarse and I try to talk through it, eventually I'm reduced to like interpretive dance, and it is not nearly as good for my students when that's what I'm doing. It's great to be a part of this particular series that we've got going on here, this discussion of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is something that is near and dear to my heart. I lead a lot of groups to Israel, and a lot of the people who are coming with me, that's what they're doing, is they're making a pilgrimage. Excuse me. But what I want to do today is I want to talk about how pilgrimage fits in to the Bible's story of the wilderness and the desert. And so we're going to start with Moses. The story of Moses is so full that there's no way that one lecture could contain the entire thing. I'll tease you with just a couple of little ideas from it. This is the way Exodus 2 begins. It says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank." I love that little passage there. There's a line in there that sounds so odd. It says, "And when she saw that he was a fine child." What mom doesn't look and sees that this is a fine child? I mean, for heaven's sake, they made a whole Seinfeld episode out of it where we never get to see the child, but while the parents think the kid is beautiful, everyone else just sort of recoils in horror from seeing it. What do we mean when it says, "when she saw that he was a fine child"? Well, the key is there's a word play, but you only get it if you read it in Hebrew. It says, "and when she saw that he was good." And you're supposed to pick up that line from Genesis 1, and God saw that it was good. This is a creation story. God is going to be creating a people instead of creating the world here. Even the word for basket, Hebrew has actually several words for basket. None of them is used in this particular passage. The word that's used is the word tevah. Well, tevah only occurs in 2 places in the whole Bible. One is the story of Moses. The other is the story of Noah. Tevah is the word for ark. It's another creation illusion. What she's doing is she's putting him in a little ark and covering the outside with bitumen and pitch, just like Noah's ark there. The Exodus is a creation story. Moses' story, it's just a story that just works. It's a rags to riches story. It's the kind that we, as certainly as Americans, we love to hear, that, from nowhere to become someone. It's a story that's just full of irony. The fact that it's Pharaoh's edict that ends up bringing Pharaoh's worst enemy into his own household. It's that ironic element there. The fact that Moses' mother ends up nursing Moses and getting paid to do it. I mean, these kinds of ironic touches are all over the place. It's a story that just works. Well, to start off here, there are 3 stories about Moses that take place in the second half of Exodus chapter 2. The first one, and these are very familiar, we know these. You have either seen Val Kilmer, or, well, I guess if it's animated, maybe it's not exactly Val Kilmer, or Charlton Heston, do all of the things here. The first story about Moses is when he delivers the Hebrew from the Egyptian. Exodus 2:11 says this, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." So there's our first story. The second one is when he delivers the Hebrew from the Hebrew, which again we know about. "When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So there's our second story. And then our third story is Moses is going to deliver Jethro's daughters from the shepherds who were there. Verse 16 says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters." I love that that's how they introduce him. It's going to come up in a second. It's one of my favorite lines in the entire Bible. So it introduces him by saying he had 7 daughters. They came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. So that's our third story. And then you get a little bit of an aftermath. It says, when they came home to their father Reuel, Jethro's got a couple of different names in the Bible. Reuel, friend of God, is one of them. He said, "How is it that you've come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." All right, now you got to go back to that first line. Now Jethro had 7 daughters, okay? He said to his daughters, "And where is he? You left that one back at the well? Girls, help me out. I've got 7 of you to find husbands for, and this is the one that you leave back at the well? Where is he?" It says, "Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a strange land." So we've got 3 stories here at the beginning about Moses, and I think there are actually 3 lessons that we can draw from those 3 stories. The first lesson is that Moses is powerful. Moses is a powerful figure. He actually has, if you read a lot of these ancient birth stories, he has a hero's birth. There are lots of these legendary figures like, say, Hercules, who is abandoned by his mother Alcmene, or Oedipus, who's left to be exposed on a mountain. Romulus and Remus, they're actually put into a box and then thrown into the Tiber River. There, Cyrus is ordered by his royal grandfather to be left to die on a mountain. These are all these larger-than-life characters, and Moses' birth kind of fits that story. There's a story about one of the kings whose name was Sargon I. And the story is so similar that a lot of scholars actually just think that Moses' story is copied from that story of the great Sargon there. It's not actually my view on the matter. I think this is just where Moses' mother gets the idea for how to try to hide him. But this is a story that would have resonated with the people back then as a hero's birth. He has the pedigree of growing up in a royal household. Now, Moses is not really like a prince of Egypt. It's not the way that either the animated movie or the 10 Commandments puts it. He's not really the second son or anything, but he still has that cachet of having grown up in the royal household. He's powerful. When he strikes someone, they die. The Hebrew word to strike, it actually is perfect. It's the word nakah. I imagine my mother saying, "I will nakah you into next week if you keep doing something like that." This is the idea. Well, people nakah one another all over this passage. Moses nakahs someone and they die. He's a powerful figure. He drives off a group of shepherds. It is so hard for us to get our heads around what shepherds in this part of the world are like, because our image of shepherds is out of a James Herriot, kind of novel or something, or maybe you've seen the movie Babe, and you've got James Cromwell with all of the rock walls and the lovely green hills. That is not who we're talking about. These are hard men. These are cowboys. These are rednecks. These are guys that live out in the wild in difficult kind of circumstances here. And Moses drives off a group of these shepherds to take care of the girls there. Moses is powerful. Second thing, Moses is compassionate. Moses is compassionate. He goes out and he looks on the suffering of his fellow Hebrews there, and he's moved by it. It says in verse 11, "One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor." You can tell that this strikes him to his heart. He always intervenes on the side of the underdog. You notice we don't really know why the Hebrew is being beaten by the Egyptian. Did he smart off to the Egyptian? Was he not doing something? We have no idea. And it makes no difference to Moses. If the Egyptian's beating the Hebrew, he's on the side of the Hebrew. When it's the two Hebrews who are fighting, it's clear that it's not just an equal match between the two, but one of them is in the wrong, it says. And so Moses intervenes on the side of the Hebrew who is being beaten. When it's Jethro's daughters at the well, I mean, he could have just laid back and, enjoyed the sport of these guys giving these girls a hard time or something like that, but that's not what he does. He intervenes on the side of the daughters. He even waters the flock. It's actually something that's quite unusual for this part of the world in that time period, is that, and it's not my view, I'm just the messenger, men didn't carry water in that day. In fact, there's a little detail that kind of points this direction. Remember when the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he says, "Well, go into town and you'll find a man carrying water. He's the one that will tell you where it is." Well, this has to be something distinctive. That if you came to Samford's campus and said, "Look for a guy wearing a ball cap," it could be anybody. This needs to be something that's unique. If you watch Lawrence of Arabia, and in one of the closing scenes, when they have finally taken over Damascus, and they're at that enormous round table where all the different tribes are trying to sort of come to an agreement about something, they're talking about how there's a building that's on fire, and they say, "Well, it's your job to go and fix that." And they say, I can't remember the name of the tribe, but the Aliwad tribe does not carry water. And so they're willing to let the electrical station burn rather than carry water. And yet Moses, he intervenes on behalf of the young ladies there and even waters the flock. Moses is powerful. Moses is compassionate. And the third thing is, Moses is lost. In the story of the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, it is clear that this is not someone who's a prince of Egypt. He looks this way and that. He hides the body. When it's over, Pharaoh wants to kill him. These are not the actions of someone who really is the second son for the Egyptian empire. He is not really an Egyptian. On the other hand, when he intervenes on the side of the Hebrew who's being beaten by the other Hebrew, you remember the question, who made you a prince and a judge over us? It's a good question, because at that point, no one had made him a prince or a judge over them. He's not really an Egyptian, but the truth is he's not really a Hebrew either. He didn't apparently live with them. He had to go out to see their suffering there. When he gets over to Midian, the shepherd girls see the way that he's dressed, and they say, "Oh, an Egyptian helped us." He's an Egyptian, but not really an Egyptian. He's a Hebrew, but not really a Hebrew. And you remember the name that he gives to the son. It says that he marries Zipporah, and she gives birth to a son. It says that she names that son Gershom, and then he explains what the name means. He says, "I've been a sojourner in a foreign land." We know this, probably better traditionally as I was a stranger in a strange land, is the way that phrase, when God wrote the King James Version, was supposed to be read there. Well, the word Gershom is a word play. Ger means stranger, and Shom is related to the word Sham, which means there. Moses is over in Midian. He looks back at Egypt and he says, "I didn't belong there. I was a stranger there. I wasn't an Egyptian. I wasn't really a Hebrew. I was a stranger in a strange land. I was a foreigner in a foreign land." Moses had to make his pilgrimage to the desert in order to find who he really was. We could say that in the short term, Moses is in the wilderness and he's finding himself. He's figuring out who he really is. He can look back and say, "I was a stranger in a strange land," which sort of leaves us with the implication that he has finally found himself. Now that he's over in Midian, he had found hospitality. He had married Zipporah. It says he was content to dwell with him, that he has finally found a place where he belongs. He had to go to the wilderness to find peace. He had to go to the wilderness to find contentment. On a longer view, though, we know that it's not just about Moses finding peace and finding contentment. Moses' wilderness experience is a time of preparation for Moses. It is a journey into the wilderness that will be the reset before his life's great labor, which will be delivering his people from slavery. I love Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness. It's a funny kind of phrase. It actually says behind the wilderness. And we don't know what that means. I take it to be kind of like when we down here say middle of nowhere, that kind of thing. You know, not like the left side or the right side of nowhere, but the very middle of nowhere. I think this is the phrase. It says he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There are two different traditions in the Bible for the name of this mountain. One is Horeb, and the other one is Sinai. This is a passage that uses the Horeb name there. It says, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Verse 3, then Moses said, I just love this line, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. And my question is always the same. Who is he talking to? It's just he's been out in the middle of nowhere with the sheep for too long, and so now he's speaking to the sheep apparently. I must go and see this great sight. And the sheep are like, knock yourself out. I don't know, it just strikes me as funny. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have seen the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians. And a verse later it says, so come, I will send you to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Moses. I am sure, in fact, we can tell from the text that Moses was nodding along, saying, this is great, you're going to deliver the people. Are you notifying all of the people individually that this is what you're going to do? And then there's that line, so now I'll send you to do this, which Moses, of course, doesn't want to do. Moses has gone to the wilderness. He has made his pilgrimage to Midian as a time of preparation for the great work that he has that lies in front of him. I find it quite interesting to see how many people in the rest of Scripture follow in Moses' footsteps, that they will have their own times of preparation in the wilderness. First and most obviously, it's the Israelites. The Israelites are going to literally follow in Moses' footsteps. If you read the passage carefully in chapter 3, this is what God says to him. He says, I'll be with you. This is after Moses has objected. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And God answers, doesn't really matter. I am the one who's going to be with you. The Lord said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, y'all shall worship God on this mountain. In other words, the Israelites are going to come right back to this place where Moses is. Moses has made his journey into the wilderness. The people are going to make their journey into the wilderness. There's even a word play in here. The word for bush in Hebrew is Sinai, and the word for the mountain is Sinai. It's telling us we're going to come right back to this spot. The Israelites have their own time in the wilderness to prepare for what life will be like serving God. They have to learn to trust. They're going to learn to trust His authority, learn to trust in His provision. There's another character who does this, Elijah. Elijah is someone who follows in the footsteps of Moses. I don't have the time to go through it, but my poor students at Samford will get this later on this week. I have a lecture that we will be doing. I even have a delightful handout that will show just time after time after time the lives of Elijah and Moses are written in parallel. In fact, it's so close that you can tell that one author is relying on the other text as they tell the story in the same order there. The confrontation between Elijah and Ahab is the same confrontation as Moses and Pharaoh. They're put together so clearly. You know, 1 Kings 18 is that pinnacle story of Elijah's life when there's the contest with the prophets of Baal. I actually have a picture of, if you go to the Carmelite monastery that is up at the top of Mount Carmel, it's called Mufraqah in Arabic up there. You go up there, and it's a beautiful place. I mean, you can look out one direction and see the Mediterranean. You look out the other direction, you can see the Jezreel Valley that's there. And there's a statue of Elijah the prophet. And so he's standing there. He has his sword raised over his head. And we have a picture of our son, Elijah, standing in front of the other prophet, Elijah, also holding his hand up like this as if he had a sword in his hand. It's a great picture, actually. We don't often pay attention, though, to the stories that follow after that contest. The next chapter says, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I don't make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he got up and he fled for his life, and he came to Beersheba. He's heading south when he goes to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Elijah actually has the same sort of odd request of God that the Israelites have when they're in the wilderness. Listen to the way that the Israelites complain here in Numbers 20. There was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and against Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we had died when our kindred died before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Do you hear how the mixed message they have? I wish we were dead because we're going to die. That doesn't make any sense, you know. I wish we were dead because we're going to die, but isn't that exactly what Elijah said? He asked that he might die because Jezebel's going to kill him. It's an odd prayer request. I'll just throw that out there. It goes on, it says, then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. He looked, and there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat. Otherwise the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Where does Elijah go? He goes to the same place that Moses had gone. He goes to the same place that the Israelites had gone. He goes into the wilderness. He goes to this mountain of God. Listen to this next little bit of the passage, and it sounds a lot like an experience from Moses' life. At that place, he came to a cave, and he spent the night there. The word of the Lord came to him, saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. He said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Remember that story with Moses, when God will pass by. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And that's where he encounters God. With Moses, it says, see, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock. I'll cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I'll take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Moses and Elijah. Elijah's following in Moses' footsteps. He's doing the same thing that the great prophet Moses did. And this is his moment of preparation. This is his moment to finally go back and take on Ahab and bring his dynasty to an end. This pilgrimage idea is not restricted to the Hebrew Bible. You find it even in the New Testament. There's a line, I don't know if you've heard it before, but if you've ever looked at the book of Galatians, this is where Paul is talking about how when he first came to faith, he said, you've heard no doubt of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many of the people of my same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born, called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim him among the nations, I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once to Arabia. When Paul had his Damascus Road experience, he didn't leave from Damascus and go to Jerusalem. He left from Damascus and went into the wilderness. Paul uses the word Arabia exactly 2 times in all of his letters. Twice, both times, are in Galatians. The first is here at the beginning when he says he went into Arabia. The second is in chapter 4 when he refers to Mount Sinai, that is in Arabia. Where Paul was going was where Moses went. It's where the Israelites went. It's where Elijah went. Paul is going to the region where Sinai was. And of course, we all know the most famous of the wilderness experiences. It's the wilderness experience of Jesus himself. Jesus, just like Paul and Elijah and the Israelites and Moses, takes his pilgrimage into the wilderness. All 3 of the synoptic gospels describe that wilderness experience. Matthew is at pains to draw a comparison between Moses on the one hand and Jesus on the other. When he discusses Jesus, he casts him as the second Moses, the one who's following in his footsteps, just like Elijah did. You remember that in both stories, there is a birth during a time of threat. When it's Moses, it's Pharaoh's edict to kill the boys. When it's Jesus, it's Herod's edict to kill the boys. There's this miraculous deliverance that takes place in Egypt. When it's Moses who is in the little ark there, the basket. When it's Jesus who, with the Holy Family, goes down to Egypt in the flight to Egypt. My wife's mom is a kindergarten teacher before she retired, and she had the kids do Christmas pictures one time, and so they drew their Christmas pictures, and one little guy, she looks at his, and it's an airplane. And she says, Johnny, you were supposed to be doing Christmas pictures. And he said, Miss Renix, I did do Christmas pictures. It's the flight to Egypt. So she looks at the picture and she sees, okay, Mary and Joseph, there's baby Jesus. Well, who's this? Pontius, the pilot. What does pilot mean to you when you're 4? It doesn't mean anything. He was the pilot on the flight to Egypt that's there. When we went to Egypt, it was, I'm telling you, the Holy Family, they got around because our tour guide, this is the place where the Holy Family, this is my brother Ahmed's rug shop. The Holy Family, this is where they buy their rugs, when they're here. It was a great moment. I mean, it was you just kind of smile and wave, when you hear it. But there's that time in the wilderness. Moses spends 40 years in the wilderness, and Jesus 40 days in the wilderness. The temptations in the wilderness are for food, and God supplies the manna, or for worship, like the golden calf, and the temptation that Jesus is faced with is turn the stones to bread, or bow down before me and I'll give you the kingdoms. Both Moses and Jesus passed through the waters. It's the waters of the Red Sea. Jesus, it's the waters of baptism. And they both delivered the law on a mountain. It's actually pretty interesting if you look at it. We know for Moses that it's there on Mount Sinai. What's so interesting, though, is the way that we talk about the Sermon on the Mount. That's only Matthew. In Luke, it says when Jesus was on a level place. And so, if you go, you can look at it. It's just a hillside. I wouldn't exactly call it it's kind of like Samford's campus. You wouldn't call it Mount Samford. On the other hand, it is a hill, especially when you have to park in the wrong spot and walk across it. Well, why in the world does Matthew call it the Sermon on the Mount? It's because he's trying to help you make the connection with Moses delivering the law on a mountain. It is interesting that even Jesus needed this time of preparation. He followed in the footsteps of Moses. He went into the desert and experienced its privations. Like Moses and Elijah, it was there that God ministered to him through the angels. The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in the bush there. Elijah has the angels who come. It says in Matthew 4, then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. It's the same experience. When Moses and Elijah and Jesus go into the wilderness, they are going back to the place where Israel's faith began. Their journeys are reminders that it was in the desert that God and Israel first joined into that covenant with one another. It is interesting how much the religion of Israel is tied back to that wilderness experience. 3 times a year, all of the Israelite males were obliged to go to Jerusalem or to go to wherever the temple would eventually be placed, and they're supposed to worship. Well, those 3 festivals that they do this on, one is Passover. Well, what is Passover? It recalls the deliverance from Egypt, where they set out into the desert. The second one is it's called Shavuot in Hebrew. We call it Pentecost. And Pentecost is where we remember the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And then in the fall, there's the one that's called Sukkot, or booths, or tabernacles. This is the one that recalls those temporary shelters that they lived in when they were in the wilderness wanderings. The 3 festivals that obliged the Israelites to go to the temple were 3 festivals that were all about the wilderness experience. It's the moment of deliverance. It's the moment of receiving the law. It's the moment of those wilderness wanderings. When you have to do it 3 times a year, I don't know if you can call it a pilgrimage. Because it's like, calling coming this morning a pilgrimage. It's not exactly that. But it is an echo of a pilgrimage. And those kinds of echoes were the things that fleshed out the faith of Israel. Even the tabernacle. The point of the tabernacle is to be a reminder of the experience at Mount Sinai. If you think about how the tabernacle was set up, there was one part where the Israelites could come, and then one part where only the elders could come, and then one part where only the high priest could come. Or if we're at Sinai, it's the people, and then it's Moses and Aaron, and then only Moses at the very top there. Well, those are the 3 sections of the tabernacle, where the regular people can come to the outer courtyard, but only the priest can go into the holy place, and only the high priest can go into the Holy of Holies. At the center of the Sinai experience is the giving of the law, giving the 10 Commandments. At the center of the tabernacle is the 10 Commandments in the Ark of the Covenant there. The smoke and fire that are on the mountain at Sinai, or the smoke and fire that are constantly going up from the tabernacle, these are the same experience. Sometimes in our faith journey, a return to the desert is what we need. When Israel proved unfaithful to God and started worshiping Baal instead, this is how Hosea 2 puts it. I will punish her for the festival days of the Baals, when she offered incense to them and decked herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers and forgot me, says the Lord. Listen to this. Therefore, I will now allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. From there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she shall respond as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. This, Hosea is casting the relationship between God and Israel in such strongly marital terms. Truthfully, when it does this, it's following in the footsteps of the book of Exodus. Exodus is describing a marriage at Mount Sinai. There's the preparation beforehand. There's the covenant that they enter into. And there's even the marking on both parties. If you read chapter 24 of Exodus, they sacrifice the animals. They take half the blood and they pour it out onto the ground at the foot of the altar they've made. And then they take the other half and they sprinkle it on the people, just like a wedding ring. Marks both parties. Blood is marking both parties. God and Israel are married at this point. And there's a little detail in the story that's so fascinating that when they, before Sinai had happened, they say, put a boundary, don't let anyone cross over. If they cross over this boundary, they'll die. Chapter 24, it says that after they've been marked with the blood, after they've agreed to the covenant, it says that Moses and the elders, they go up the mountain. It says they beheld God. And it says, and they ate and drank, but God did not raise his hand against them. Why not? Because now they're married. This is now a relationship where they are married to one another, and so they have the wedding feast that follows the experience there, and they are able to actually see God. Our faith is a faith that was born in the desert. Israel's festivals were meant to remind them of that desert experience. Figures like Elijah and Paul and Jesus made their pilgrimages back to the desert. They went there to find out who they really were, and what God wanted them to do, we benefit just as well when we remember the desert origins of our faith. The first Passover was a meal that set the Israelites moving into that desert experience. It set the stage for that time of trial that was going to follow. We shouldn't forget that the Lord's Supper was a Passover feast. It's tying into that desert moment when Jesus inaugurated this rite. He used the language of remembering. He says, do this in remembrance of me. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. What is it that he says that we're remembering? For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. See, Christ's death is that new wilderness experience. It's that new wilderness experience, that indeed ultimate wilderness experience that captures where we are. Even now, we live in a desert of sorts. We have experienced the death of the Messiah. In the present, we face those privations of spiritual hunger and spiritual thirst. We look forward to the moment when we can return home from this desert moment. What is that return home? It's when that resurrection that Jesus inaugurated becomes the resurrection that we experience. When we finally leave the desert, which is his death, and enter the promised land, which is his resurrection. When our pilgrimage leads us back home. Any questions? I'd be delighted to answer anything you might have.
My wife asked if we could like your class.
I tell my students that, they have no idea how lucky they are to be in my class. With all humility, I said, there are tears streaming down the cheeks of students who have other professors because I actually joke with my Hebrew students that, while everyone else is kind of outside the gates, that Hebrew students, they get to sit in Jesus' lap and, swim in the heavenly pool. The others who decided to take Spanish or French or something like that, they're just looking in during the adult swim time and they don't get to be there.
Here you go.
Okay, thank you. I have a question relating to that, though. Samford does have evening classes that last several weeks. Do you teach any of those?
I don't actually teach in those. Those are sponsored by the Divinity School,
Okay.
and I'm in the undergraduate section.
Okay.
But the professors are quite wonderful,
They are.
and they're dear colleagues and do a terrific job with them. So it's well worth doing it. Yeah, absolutely.
How does Father Abraham fit into your narrative today?
Well, it is quite interesting, I think, because there is a strong anti-civilization motif that runs through the first part of the book of Genesis, and it goes all the way up through Abraham's life. And so if you trace it out, it is not a coincidence that the way that the early chapters of Genesis describe the construction of the first city is by Cain. And so, it's like, well, that's going to leave a mark. That, Cain is the first city builder. When I actually think Genesis 1 through 11 is a response to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if you read Gilgamesh, the whole point is that Gilgamesh is trying to find immortality, and he can't find it, but he eventually returns back to the town that he built, Uruk, and he says, that's my immortality. This will live on after me, and it will carry on my name. And so his immortality is found in a city. Well, Genesis 1 through 11 is going just, quite contrary to that and saying, no, we find our immortality in our relationship with God, not in our cities. And it's the reason why that first section of the Bible ends with the Tower of Babel. The story of the Tower of Babel is not about the tower. It's about the city. Every time that it mentions the tower, it refers to the city. When the tongues are confused, it no longer talks about the tower. It just says they stopped building the city. It puts the city as the sort of capstone of that section of Scripture to say this was a group of people that said, let us make a name for ourselves, like Gilgamesh. And God says, no, we're just not going to do that. And so, I'm not taking that story as like a straight historical story, but the point that it's trying to make is one that our identity is not found in cities. And then eventually you see Abraham and Lot. When they split up, Lot keeps moving closer and closer and closer to the cities of the plain, and eventually he just becomes corrupted by it. In fact, when he's leaving from Sodom and Gomorrah, he begs the angel, there's a little bitty city over there, let me just go to that one. Because he's been so consumed by this, city life. Abraham's the sort of counter to that he does well when he's on his own and not in cities there. Cities, I'm a city person. I'm from here. I've lived in New York. I've lived in Boston. So those are, there's a part of cities that I like. But cities satisfy all our needs and delude us into the idea that we thereby have no need for God. And sometimes it's when we're out in the wild that we recognize, we really are dependent people.
Short question about pilgrimages. People that go, I'm reading, people that go with a purpose, and people that are somewhere and find a purpose by chance or happenstance. I was wondering if you could relate the scripture to those two experiences, if you can. If not, fine.
It's interesting that Moses and the Israelites are reluctant entrance into the desert. People like Elijah and Paul and Jesus are deliberate in their doing it. And I think probably with those latter examples, there is an element of, clarifying one's purpose. They do it just before they're about to enter into the high point of their ministry, especially with Jesus and Paul. They go into the wilderness because they know, I'm about to start this. I need to set the table. I need to have a reset and find exactly what I'm going to do in that moment. And I think that's probably accurate. Certainly with the people that I take to Israel, it's neat to see those who are doing it as a pilgrimage, that they recognize this is a capstone experience in my life, that this is something that I want to do, and I'm going to just embrace it for all that it's worth there. They have better trips when they do it because they're doing it with such purpose there. Well, y'all, I think we are at time. So let's close here. It was a delight to be with y'all.